Welcome back, guys. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and we're going to talk today about FDR and going into World War II and what happens. We're going to talk first about kind of the run-up to Pearl Harbor and a little bit about some stuff in China. And then the second lesson, we're going to talk about World War II. So let's jump right in. First slide I want you to see here is a map of China. Yes, it looks like a chicken. And so here's a map of China. And on the next slide, what we see is this war in Japan and China, well, it's actually in China. Japan attacks China. In July of 37, Japan invades Manchuria. October, Japan invades Shanghai. December, Japan invades Nanjing. And October, Wuhan falls to Japan. That's about as far. They get a little bit further west, but that's not much further. Now, I covered this in my American history classes because most Americans don't really know that much about China's involvement in World War II. Most Americans know Europe was in World War II and that D-Day was on June 6, and some other battles in Europe during World War II, but we don't know a whole lot about what happened in China with Japan. So if you ask most Americans when did World War II start, then most will say either 1939 or 1941. Well, of course, as Chinese know, it began earlier than that. And some Chinese would even put it back to, say, 1933 or even perhaps a little bit further back than that. But 1937 is the Japanese invasion of China. Now, it is believed that particularly in Nanjing, very famous, infamous really, invasion in Nanjing, it's believed that perhaps nearly 300,000 people died in Nanjing alone from December to January 1937 to 1938. And of the total deaths in World War II, approximately 50 to 75 million, perhaps as many as 20 to 25 million were Chinese. That means that perhaps China lost 1 out of every 3 people that died in World War II. So often Americans think about the Jews, about 6 or 7 million Jews died, but how many Chinese died? So many. China sacrificed greatly, perhaps more than any other country during World War II. And the role that they played was very important because they kept Japan busy. If China had surrendered to Japan, which was never going to happen, but if China had surrendered to Japan, Japan then can take all of their troops in China, 2 million soldiers, and move them to fight the United States. And so China helped win the war. It was very important. China and the United States were allies during this period. Now, how do we know that the 300,000 Chinese died in Nanjing? The Japanese didn't keep record of this. It's because they were foreigners. There were some Americans and some Canadians and a German named John Rabe. And these people kept, as best they could, of course, they're not counting the people they see that are dead, but they're taking tallies and they're doing the best that they can through research to arrive at these figures. So very important. On the next slide, you can see if you ever have a chance to visit some archives, any archives about the China-Japan War in 1937, you'll see all kinds of really terrible pictures of what the Japanese did to China. Now, today Japan is different and China is different as well. And so there's not this animosity, and we don't want to say that China is bad. China is good. We don't want to say Japan is bad because Japan today is also good. History is important, but we should, as we learn from history, we learn also to become better friends. So this is a very important lesson that we can learn from World War II. But there is an important book that I would encourage you to read. It's called The Rape of Nanking, and it's by Iris Chang. And I think you should probably be able to find it at your bookstore, in your nearest bookstore in China. It's a very good book, and I have my students read it here in the United States. It's about how brutal the invasion of China was by Japan, particularly in Nanjing. Now, if we look at the next slide, this is the question that I will ask my students. What does this have to do with America? Why does Japan and China fighting, what does this have anything to do with the United States? And what is the American political stance in 1937? Remember, this is the Great Depression. And that's where we are economically as well. So the New Deal is taking place, the Great Depression is taking place, and World War II in Asia is taking place. Now, if we look at the next slide, we can see this image called America's Share in Japan's War Guilt. This was published by a group of American missionaries who had lived in China, were born in China, spent lots of time in China, and they came back to the United States, and they began to try to convince American politicians to stop selling scrap metal and oil, gasoline, and rubber, and other kinds of metal, copper, to Japan, because Japan is taking these things and using it to make airplanes and bombs to drop on China. But they didn't do a very good job convincing the politicians at first. Well, why not? We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, look at this next slide. You can see all of the things that the Japanese are getting from the United States. Almost 93% of all copper the Japanese are getting from the United States. The parts for automobiles, 91% of what they're getting is coming from the United States. All oil for gasoline and things, all of that is 60% of that is coming from the United States. As you can see, all the way down the list, you can see a total in aggregate, a total kind of average is about 54.5%. So many things are coming from the United States that are helping the Japanese fight a war against China. And so the United States is friends with China. Why should we not stop selling these things to Japan? Look at the next slide. This next slide has the American Committee for the Non-Participation of Japanese Aggression. Started by two brothers named Frank and Harry Price. Bifanyu is Frank Price, very famous in missionary circles during the 1920s and 1930s and 40s. And this committee is staffed by journalists who'd been in China and by missionaries. And the Chinese government also paid some of these Americans to help convince the United States government to help change opinion in the United States. And so if we look at the next slide, we can see this timeline we're looking at. 1937, most Americans are isolationist. Now that means they don't want to get involved in other people's business. They want to just look inward, focus on making a profit. That's what they want to do. They don't want to get into another war. World War I was bad. They don't want another war. The war in Asia in 1938 is not important to Americans. It's not affecting our economy. The Chinese don't buy much from us at this point. The Japanese are buying a lot from us, and so why should we stop selling things to the Japanese? But finally, in 1939, there's something called the Neutrality Act. And neutrality means that we don't choose sides. We just kind of stay in the middle. But this also continues to allow the United States to sell things to Japan. So we can sell to China and Japan, so they can fight each other. And that's what American businessmen were doing to make money. But many Americans said, no, this is not okay. We need only to sell things to China because Japan is the bad guy. And so finally, in 1940, after 3 years, in 1940, the United States passes a law that bars shipment of some goods to Japan. But Americans are still divided. They don't want war, and they're afraid that stopping selling things to Japan will make Japan angry and will attack us, and they don't want that. And finally, in 1941, the United States passes the Lend-Lease provision, which means that we can lend ships and airplanes and things to our allies, China, and also in Europe. And finally, in 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. And we're going to talk just a little bit about that. If you remember December 7, 1941, an important day in American history. And that's when the United States finally does get into the war. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, in the next lesson. But I do want you to know, because we're not in the war until 1941 December, but from 1939, the war begins in Europe. And if you look at the next slide, what you'll see is an airplane and a tank. Hitler, these are Nazi airplanes and tanks, and Hitler has developed this Panzer, these small tanks that are fast and they can do lots of damage. But also this airplane is called Der Stuka, and this airplane, it will come down through the sky and it makes this, and you hear the sound of the bombs, and it terrifies you. You can hear the plane coming and you hear the bombs screaming through the sky, and it was meant to scare you. even if the bomb didn't hit you, it scared you to death. And they had this little device on the bomb that would make it sound, that would make it whistle as it went through the air. So it was a very terrifying sound to listen to. On the next slide, we see the Battle of Britain. And the Battle of Britain takes place from July to October 1940. And London is blacked out at night. They put black curtains on their walls and they turn their lights out because they don't want the German bombers to see them as they fly over London. So if you can make the city completely dark, then the bombers cannot see it. Still, the bombers did see it. They just didn't see it as well. And so there was 90,000 casualties during this battle. July, August, September, October. We have about 4 months that this battle is taking place, and there's 90,000 casualties and 40,000 deaths during this Battle of Britain. Not just in London, but in Britain. In 1940, we see that Roosevelt is the first president. On the next slide, we see he's the first president to win a third presidential election. No president before Roosevelt has won 2 elections, but he's doing such a good job with the economy, and they're so happy that he's kept us out of war so far that they re-elect him a third time. And you can see it's not as convincing in 1940 as it was in 1936, but he still wins by a landslide. On the next slide, shortly after he becomes president in 1940, he begins to change policy. We're moving away from an isolationist position to what we call an interventionist position. So he begins to offer cash and carry. So if you want to buy ships and airplanes from us, you can pay cash and then you can take it home. You carry it home and you pay us in cash. Anyone can do this. Japan could have done it, but Germany could have done it. But we expect that Japan and Germany won't do it. So we're really focusing on China, and we're focusing on Europe as well with this one. And in 1939, FDR ordered 20,000 planes to be built. Remember Henry Ford, who we talked about in the last chapter with all of his cars? The Ford factory in Dearborn, Michigan, near Detroit, becomes an airplane factory. The Lend-Lease, he continues to lend out and lease war equipment to his allies, and he authorized the U.S. Navy to sink any German ships or submarines or U-boats if they feel threatened while they are sailing in the Atlantic. And so this is a major step. Essentially, it's an act of war. Now, the United States has gone completely from an isolationist power, where we didn't want to be involved in war, to an interventionist power where we are going to intervene to stop war. And that's a major step from 1937 to 1941, early 1941. So that's where we're going to leave it for here, and we'll kind of talk about World War II in the next lesson. All right, we'll see you guys then. Bye-bye.